My name is Chris Scrabel, and I'm the Director of Chicago Studies and Experiential Learning in the Undergraduate College. Today's presentation is the last in a series of distinguished lectures, community conversations, and other events that have sought to point us to ways for our city to move forward after an incredibly difficult period in our history. This series, which we've entitled Chicago Futures, was developed as a collaboration between two offices within the college. Chicago Studies offers curricular and co-curricular opportunities for our community to study, engage with, and positively impact the diverse communities of our world-class city. The Parizia program for public discourse offers courses and programming that aim to develop communicative competence and foster vigorous, inclusive, and productive public discourse within a wide variety of communities. To date, our series has included 7 distinguished lectures and 5 community conversations with representatives of local industries significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic specifically. All of these have been recorded and are or will soon be available on the Chicago Studies website. This Friday, we'll host our final event of this series, a community conversation and live podcast recording about the future of Chicago's vibrant music scene. The Chicago Futures series as a whole was generously co-sponsored by the Office of the President. Today's session is also co-sponsored by our friends in the Program on the Global Environment and features the Faculty Director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, another important partner. Our partners at Program on the Global Environment have asked that we remind you of an important event that they are hosting tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. This year's keynote address of the Frizzell Family Speaker and Learning Series is a conversation with pediatrician and author Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, one of the first medical professionals to discover the crisis of lead poisoning affecting the residents of Flint, Michigan. You can register for this event on the PGE website or on the Chicago Studies events page. And while you're on our events page, we encourage you to check out 2 more upcoming opportunities from Chicago Studies. Next Wednesday, we will host our annual Chicago Research Colloquium, featuring presentations of some of the most outstanding undergraduate research about the city. We're in the middle of reviewing submitted BAs from across the college, but hope to announce our finalists and our presenters by the end of the week. The colloquium, hosted over Zoom, will begin with a welcome by Dean Boyer at 12:30 and will end with a panel discussion featuring all our 4th-year presenters. And last but not least, we are incredibly pleased and even a little bit relieved to announce the late-breaking return of one of our most popular in-person events, the Southeast Chicago History Bike Tour, led by Dean Boyer and Professor John Mark Hansen. This year's tour will take place on the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend with a rain date on Sunday. We'll depart the campus by 10:30 a.m. and return around 3:30 p.m. after a 21-mile, 10-stop survey of significant historical sites across deindustrialized Southeast Chicago. So if you've got a bike, dust off your helmet, pump up your tires, and register today. Space is quite limited. More information for all of these events is available on our website, chicagostudies.uchicago.edu/events. And now it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our final distinguished lecturer. When we first brought up the prospect of a series on the futures of Chicago, Dr. Luis Betancourt was the very first person to express his enthusiasm for the idea. And that's not surprising, given who Dr. Betancourt is and the focus of his own work. Luis M. A. Betancourt is the inaugural director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago and professor of ecology and evolution at the college. He's also associate faculty and special friend of the Department of Sociology and external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. He conducts interdisciplinary research on complex adaptive systems and leads efforts in the areas of the science of cities. This research focuses on the identification of cities' systemic processes and properties, as well as their local histories and contexts in identifying paths for a better quality of life, economic growth, and sustainable development. He works with international networks of researchers, local governments, and NGOs to understand and systematize urban knowledge and to create solutions to urban issues. His work is well known academically and has been influential in developing new theory and empirical perspectives on cities and on urbanization worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luis Betancourt.
Thank you, Chris. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I hope that my sound's coming okay. Let me just give me a minute to bring up the slides, and then we'll get started. So. Okay, so if that doesn't look okay, please let me know. So as I was starting to say, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm an enormous fan of Chicago Studies and of PGE and of many of the programs that will actually be co-locating with the Mansueto Institute, the Center of Spatial Data Science, and other sort of kindred spirits in 1155 New Building. And so it's a co-location, I think, of place, but it's also a co-location of spirit. And it's part of sort of the landscape of the process by which the University of Chicago continues to celebrate its wonderful, wait, what happened there? Sorry. Okay, does that look okay? Okay. I'm assuming it does. I don't know what happened. It's a way in which the University of Chicago continues to celebrate its tradition of urban scholarship, but also to take it forward in sort of a world that's urbanizing, that's full of new tools, new data, new evidence, and where a lot of cities are doing interesting things. So my talk today will be about Chicago inevitably, which always makes me a little bit nervous because I've been here not quite 4 years. So it feels both new and of course enough time to know a lot about Chicago. And what I'll do is to try to give you a sense of what data is used for in cities, and then a little bit of the history of Chicago through data and what the future of Chicago may need to look like. So Chris already introduced me, so this slide was a way of introduction. Much of what I came to do at the university and do at the university is really to introduce this nexus, but also sort of a mechanism through the Mansueto Institute for us to come together as a community also outside the university, and understand the fundamental processes that drive and sustain cities. And by that, we don't just mean big cities, we mean cities of all sizes and their relationship with non-cities and nature. And in that sense, it's an integrative view at human societies and how they change. There's also a new book that represents a lot of these ideas. If you're interested, it will come out soon in the summer. So this talk will be essentially in 3 parts. The middle part, as always, is a little bit longer and will have its own arc. But the first part may strike you as a little bit strange, but I always like to do this when I'm given sort of a theme to talk about, which is to zoom way out and to start asking, to what extent can we understand sort of the theme of this lecture, the data-driven city, the use of data in cities? Why does it happen? Why is it so important? Why people are putting obviously an increased emphasis on it today? But in some sense, has always been a feature of cities. And I think that there's a lot to be understood there and lessons to be taken. And I'll use sort of another sort of touch point of the University of Chicago, which is the historical study of cities. That won't take too long, but it will set up some general expectations. And I think from that point of contrast, you'll appreciate immediately some of the things that we're doing well and many of the things we're doing poorly in Chicago. Including in using data, but data becomes sort of a medium by which you gain perspective. The second part is really, in some sense, the character of Chicago as what's been called the best measure, the best studied city in terms of data, and in terms of just forms of evidence, qualitative and quantitative. And I'll speak a little bit to its advantage, but also a bit of its tragic character in terms of a city that in some sense knows a lot about itself, but finds it often difficult to summon sort of the clarity of action and purpose that addresses those problems. I think that character is familiar, but I also will make a point that comes from the way we've been using data. And finally, sort of the purpose of the lecture ultimately is to look a little bit ahead, which will be a look ahead not only at the place and time and where Chicago is as characterized in terms of many different quantities that I'll show you, but also what are cities doing going to the future and what do they need to do to have sort of a bright future that is better than the present. So with that, I'll basically end with a bit of an outlook and provocation that hopefully will be good for discussion. So let me start sort of with a quote. It's always good to do that. And in some sense, it's one of the points of beginning, not the only point, but an important point of scholarship in cities and scholarship in cities at UChicago, which is from the Chicago School of Urban Sociology. It's one of the opening lines of The City, Robert Park. And it's basically this quote, which is a little gnomic, but no, the city is not merely a physical mechanism or an artificial construction. Some people still think it is, but it isn't. It's actually, it is involved in the vital processes of the people who compose it. So it shapes our lives. And of course, it is constructed and built by our lives. So there's a certain interdependence of people in cities, and cities in some sense are a medium. And it is a product of nature, and particularly of human nature. And I want to kind of riff a little bit on this last sentence, because the next slide is the one in which I allow myself to be an evolutionary scientist, an ecologist, and ask a question that actually is not often asked, which is the question, why cities exist, but in general, why do social collectives exist? And if you go to biology, you really have an interesting set of approaches and questions. So I promise you not to spend a lot of time in biology, but this is kind of important in setting the stage. So there have been many transitions to biological societies, if you want to call them that have happened throughout the history of life on Earth. And there's been sort of a vital field of ecology and evolution, which is exemplified by this book. It's quite a famous book by now, but relatively still recent, 20 years ago, by Minner Smith and Zathmary, which is about the nature of these transitions. And what you observe in all these transitions is that for collectives to come, for collectives of individuals that could exist independently to come together as a society, there needs to be a channel for cooperation. In other words, that life has to be better together. There have to be mechanisms of justice that basically keep conflict down and clamp down on opportunistic behavior. And most importantly, the theme of this talk, there must be new information systems. Now, the first two you might have expected maybe just from sort of almost a material relationship point of view. But the last part is interesting. And this means essentially that every society, biological or human, in some sense has to invent its informational systems. And data is part of that, not just sort of as the tokens that allow all our relationships in parts to be mediated, but in terms of how they are framed. And we're in the moment, because of the abundance of data, but also the international context and even the context of American cities, a moment where this is being reframed. And so this is an opportunity, but it has to come from a perspective of a certain wisdom as to what data and informational systems and communication systems are used for. So here's where data comes from, right? So this is, of course, one of the great treasures at the Oriental Institute. It's a little exhibit that probably you cannot visit now, but used to be able to, and I hope will come back after we start opening the university back again. And it's a little case that shows you the early evolution of writing. Okay, so that's how it's advertised. But what you see there on the top row is not writing at all. Those little shapes and things, some of the early cities of Sumer and Mesopotamia were littered with these things. They're little clay tokens, and they're thought to be essentially the way by which people counted and kept accounts of what was transacted and owed and so forth. So that's actually the beginning of writing, and it's only over time that it continues to be that, but that it gets abstracted into symbols and other things, but also becomes a different kind of record, a record that becomes also more explicitly about ideas and natural language. So my point here is that this always comes together. It's sort of the urban perspective that allows you to understand it, that the tools that we use today and that we identify with the humanities and in some parts of the social sciences, and the tools that we identify with practical life, but also the natural sciences and computer science even, are really born out of the same need. And this need needs to be kept whole. It cannot be separated. You cannot be a good humanist without counting, and you cannot count without being a good humanist if you are to address issues of society. So this is kind of just an idea of how things came together in the beginning. And I want to show you why they came together, right? So this is one argument. It's a little BBC article. You can go and look at Denise's book. Denise Schwimmt-Besserat was a study of early economies, particularly in Sumerian cities. And she came up with a lot of the ideas about how these little cuneiform documents were accounting documents, but also ways to keep track of a lot of transactions. So this emphasizes a bit the urban economy. But a lot of our work is also about how this changed the way people think, the way that they could think relationally to each other, that they could come up with abstract ideas, that they could start doing all kinds of things that allow us a complex society to beginning to come together and organize itself. And so what's beautiful that happens at this point is that you start hearing the first voices in history. And the voices say things like 6 lambs, 1 goat, day 30th, and the name of the person in charge. They speak about the kings, but then they also are love poems, right? And sort of texts about humanity. So here's one of the first, the beginning of one of the first sort of love poems. It gets pretty racy, so I don't include the parts that come after that, but look it up if you're interested. But, you know, so there's sort of longing and calculation, right? And it's sort of this calculated longing that starts to create the nature of urban societies. And what began then, almost 5 years ago, you know, is something that's with us today, but it's been amplified. And a lot of the physical media by which we do all these things been replaced by new media that allow us to do it on a larger scale faster. But the ideas are still there from the beginning. Okay, so the ideas are the following: that whenever you have sort of cities, I call it the urban package. It's a package of institutions and technologies, but it's also a way in which we live together in a different way. The first thing that's most important, identified, including by the biologists, about this last transition, the transition of what makes human society special, is the advent of symbolic culture. And symbolic culture is both writing, it's forms of art, but it's also counting. So it's accounting, written language, standard weights and measures, time, measuring of time, and socioeconomic planning. Okay, so think about all that, and why would you have to do that? You need to do that always in a city. A city will blow up if you don't do that. But this comes also with certain things that provide glue. There's always division of knowledge and labor, there's social interdependence. And with that, you need to create public goods, so things that people can share, that become sort of advantages of living in these environments. And always social contracts, things like law, resource redistribution, no matter who you listen to in terms of your economic theory. Cities always had strong resource redistribution early on about food and basic materials. In modern forms, you know what they are, through taxes and services and so forth. But all this is about the glue that keeps people together. And when all this happens, culture grows and accumulates, and that's what makes cities so special as engines of change. And the symbolic encoding of memory and actions, both past and future, in terms of ideals, is what holds societies together. Okay, so that's very important. So writing and data are really creating this symbolic culture that tells us who we are and where we're going. And without that, with that, societies learn, so things change and history begins. So this is why historians often identify the beginning of writing, which is the beginning of cities, with the beginning of history. Okay, but as these things fail or don't do so well, we have lots of problems. And so I want you to just spare thought for the Sumerians and a little bit for our condition in Chicago for a moment, and think about how all these, at least 4 things and their decomposition, are really expressed in our Chicago, and think about what we could do that would make them better. Okay, but just to say how powerful this stuff is, right? You know this, but this is really important. The way we tell time today, the way we measure angles, is because of the way the people in Sumeria, right, 5,000 years ago, decided to start measuring these things. So we still do it the same way. We do law, like, you know, the classical cities. A lot of our languages and written languages and alphabets came from different places throughout history. But these ideas travel, and they enable complex societies to exist. And they're very resistant to change as well. And they embed wave after wave of transformation. So with that, I want to finish this section just with another quote. Think about Chicago again as you read it, and then I'll tell you what he's writing about. It says, all workable social systems are predicated on creating reliable forms of cooperation, the glue, among all an extensive population, and then distributing the fruits of that cooperation across the population in ways that prevent the outbreak of catastrophic levels of violence. In Chicago, we may discuss what catastrophic is, but you see that this tension is really in play and needs to be resolved. He's talking actually the beginning of institutions in classical Athens, and the fact that Josiah Ober, a fantastic historian at Stanford of classical cities, really is talking about the invention of institutions, particularly of democracy, but the first laws, which are actually anti-hubris, anti-humiliation, were really laws about dignity and a certain kind of equality for that time that allowed people to live together. Okay, so imagine sort of that kind of thing at American cities, and what should it be and how well are we doing? Okay, so now I want to kind of completely shift gears, and I want to bring us to Chicago. And I'm going to do this in a very incomplete way, as you'll appreciate. But this will start bringing in more contemporary data. But also, I want to emphasize this idea that I've just introduced in terms of sort of early data of what is our symbolic culture? What is the symbolic culture of Chicago? How do we see ourselves? Maybe the symbolic culture, as cultures always do, was not created very intentionally and just became part of sort of our subconscious. But what does it enable, and what does it, in many ways, stop us from being able to do? Okay, so a place to start, of course, is this. So we can blame ourselves a little bit, or at least our ancestors here at the university. And you know, Chicago is an exceptional city. And the thing that that comes to mind first is that almost everyone, if you go around the world, as I do, and look at many cities and give lectures, and you know, have a bit of the lecture that's about how we understand cities, how we conceptualize them, everyone knows about Chicago, right? Because Chicago was studied by generation after generation, starting in the 1920s, especially, a little bit before as well, but then really gaining a lot of momentum and methods to become sort of, in some sense, the archetypal city, or at least an archetypal model for cities. And also a series of methods, which is more subtle and more important, that allow people to start thinking about how to understand how a city works. So I really encourage you, if you haven't done so, and you have sort of a bent, if you're a map geek like I am, or if you really like to you know, just understand visual history, the university and other collections in Chicago are exceptional. And there are many maps that have not been digitized yet at the library, probably several thousand maps. So there's sort of a certain repetition of the same idea that I'm just going to give you some glimpses of. But do go to the map library and get lost in there. It's a beautiful thing. So here's some, right? So I'm just going to give you some somewhat disorganized a collection of visuals, but emphasizing a few points. So on the left, of course, you have this kind of favorite map of Chicago, which is a map of crime. In this case, I just want you to appreciate the detail. This is a map, as you can see, I think I didn't put the date here, but it's, I think, from the 1920s, 1920, there it says. But it is the residence of all alleged male offenders in the city, right? So there they are. Each little point that you can see there, I think you might be able to see them if you squint, is an alleged male offender. So a map of crime. We love these, right? So we have these again and again and again and again. And to the right, you have the other dimension that we often plot in Chicago. It's a map from 1950, so you see a little bit of color, but it's a map of race and ethnicity. And you'll see many nationalities there, and you'll see you know, groups of people like Black and Jewish that are treated the same as French and Hungarian, you know, just sort of some alien type of people, possibly. So, you know, but it's a map of diversity, if you will, positively, but it's also a map of separation, right? It's a map that emphasizes the fact that all these people of different kinds live in different parts of the city, and in some sense may be associated with different characteristics of the city. So this is another sort of map that has conditioned a lot of how we see Chicago and how we see cities, but that emphasizes, depending, you know, how you see it, both diversity, but also separation, segregation. Okay, but there are immense maps that have a lot more detail, that are a lot less known. So I wanted to show you some of these because these are beautiful data, right? And the effort and sort of the mindset that people must have had then. So this is a map from 1908 of TB, tuberculosis, right? In a district of Chicago. I'm not sure exactly where this is. It says it's the Jewish population mostly. So there you go, all the usual preoccupations. But every little black dot that you might be able to glimpse in there is a case or a death. They're hard to distinguish at this resolution. But this is very much a John Snow map of an epidemic, very much like cholera in London some 40, 50 years before. But as you can see, for those of you who know a little bit about epidemiology, this doesn't look at all like a map of cholera because it doesn't have the same source of transmission. It's not transmitted through water. Okay, and this is another map. It's a famous one of gangland. So all the gangs of Chicago, of course. The other preoccupation of crime, but also if you are able to read it, it's hard to see probably, but you'll see all the ethnic groups with limitations. So here in the part that speaks to the University of Chicago, I pointed out there 55th Street, you see that there's gangland there. It was cleaned up after this, so to speak, during a period of urban renewal. It's unrecognizable from what it was before. And It is basically a map that tells you that this area of the city was at this point in time in the 20s, as you can see there, a mixture on the one hand of sort of the southern part of the Black Belt and the Jewish Quarter, sort of to the north a little bit of Hyde Park. So, you know, again, these kind of structural features, if you will, of the city, but sort of their emphasis on, you know, mapping and a certain separation of peoples and crime and behavior that is to some extent antisocial, like gangs, has been there all along and is with us today still. So this is another map. I love this map. I'll show you in person. I have 2 copies of it. One of them is promised to someone. I'm going to tell you who. But this is a long scroll. It's kind of feels like a, you know, a classical scroll. It's very long. I'm just showing you a little section, and it's a map of Woodlawn, and it's a map of 1932. So what you're seeing here, if you know Woodlawn, so the neighborhood just south of the university, where the law school and now the Mansfield Institute and the New Robenstein Forum and so forth is. The main street used to be 63rd Street, still is in some sense, but these are all the businesses and all the business owners that existed at that time. And as you can see, it's chock full of activity, right? It's just an incredible thing. Like every little bit of street front has a different shop. You can see the diversity of businesses. It was very cosmopolitan. And you can see also there are interesting things even in the name of the owners, at least to my eye. Didn't do a statistical analysis, but it seems to be quite diverse in terms of gender. For example, there are many women owners of businesses. On the left, of course, you have what is possible to do. This is Google Street View. And I didn't actually plan this, but I thought was just to rub a little salt in the wound, if you will. You can pay attention to what the billboard says. It's basically there's nothing, right? It's a student of ours in sociology once was doing work about Woodlawn, and it just told me, you know, it's empty. It's not empty. There are people there, but there are about maybe a quarter of the population that existed at the peak. So it's a very different neighborhood. And this existed for a variety of reasons we'll get to. But we have data on what it is now in terms of built environment, population, everything. But the reality of how it feels is what you see on the left. And on the right is almost an alien, unrecognizable city that we can remember, or at least try to imagine, because these maps exist. But these maps are pretty obscure. It's a different kind of map. I like this map. Okay, and this is kind of the last one of sort of Chicago's School of Sociology early on. And it's a map that I use in my class because it's a map of socioeconomic status, of economic status, I should say. And as you can see there, it's from 1934. And it's probably hard to read, but the dark areas, sort of blackish areas, are rich. And the whitish areas, sort of that come across as light, are poor. And what you see there, I indicated Hyde Park, which is fairly affluent then, but then what you see is that the south side is actually quite affluent. And that's left sort of in some of the traces of the built environment that you wouldn't know necessarily in Woodlawn and some of the other neighborhoods. It's clearer probably in Hyde Park and Kenwood and so forth. But it's a completely different city, right? And again, some of the same preoccupations, but it's important to know that the city was different, at least spatially, that each neighborhood is occupied by many different people, and that the city, at least on this time scale of decades, has been quite dynamic. Not always for good, but nevertheless dynamic. Okay, now I want to bring you to sort of a couple of events that are important in the intellectual history of Chicago and where it got us today. So in some sense, in my view, the turning point was at this time, and it's in some sense written about in the famous work by Bill Wilson in the 80s, where he's trying to describe what is happening to cities in the US and in Chicago in particular about a sort of deindustrialization and what he described as the formation sort of concentrated poverty, particularly African-American concentrated poverty. So what is interesting and important about his work, and I know it's been debated a lot, I'm not going to take a side, is that what he's trying to do is to have an understanding of the processes that create spatial patterns that are not driven primarily by race, but driven by economic conditions that are playing over a racialized distribution of employment, particularly in manufacturing, when those jobs go away, and then a certain separation of the populations, including Black populations, in terms of people cannot leave and the people that do leave certain neighborhoods. But this is a story also told in data. So I want to show you what he shows in this book This is done by the local community fact book, which still exists also in the library. If you go look at it, you can get some of these. They're kind of basic things, but they're being produced a lot, and has this very classical, again, you see this idea always of Chicago, of the community areas. I could have shown you more of those earlier, and what the different community areas look like, right? And so this is also the political map of the city. And what you see is sort of a before and after picture. This is for poverty, measures of poverty, and you can read the legend there. But between the 70s and 80s, you essentially form the pattern of what the city more or less becomes today. And this is a similar map, but it's a map of unemployment, which Wilson takes as being really the driver of a lot of what we start to see in terms of this creation of more isolated poor neighborhoods in Chicago. So you see that deindustrialization at this time is creating really a concentrated poverty, and concentrated poverty in the part of the city that tracks very well, unfortunately, what we still see today in terms of sort of the south side and the west side being particularly affected. So this is, in some sense, the process that's created Chicago as it looks today. We have exquisite data. This is data from the American Community Survey. And of course, we have data also from the census and from increasingly other measures that are high frequency through technology and so forth. It's a map I did a few years ago, but it shows you now at a level of block group. So it's a much smaller unit with about 1,000 people each, what a map of income in Chicago looks like. I'm sure you all have looked at this. You can discern a little bit what Hyde Park looks like there as a green little speck in the middle of the south side. But the point of showing you this is to show you that it's not very homogeneous. There's a lot of things going on. And there are bits of green amid the red and bits of red amid the green, even though there's also sort of this broader east side, south side pattern. And you can start asking, what is this made out of? Are people mixing, not mixing? What neighborhoods that really look segregated or not? This has been studied a lot, but we have new tools to do this. I'm not going to go into detail what these tools are. I just want to convey the main point that in some sense, what is happening in Chicago and many American cities is what sociologists sometimes call income polarization or social polarization, in the sense that there's a lot of mixing in a real city. And there are many neighborhoods actually that mix people by race, by income, by almost any dimension you can think of. And that's actually the norm. But there are also a few places where you find more concentrated segregation. And this is just the analysis for income. It could be other quantities. But these tend to be associated with actually the poorest neighborhoods, but also the richest neighborhoods. So I'll show you that in a second. So the moment in which this goes, and this is another important moment in Chicago history and data, also from sociology, Rob Sampson's work, but really with a lot of people at the university, including Steve Rodenbush, Kate Cagney, and many other people, really. I'm not going to do them all justice. There's this idea of looking at Chicago again from the perspective of neighborhoods, of communities, just as Bill Wilson was doing, and try to understand what sort of the drivers, particularly of the usual issues of Chicago, particularly to do with crime and concentrated poverty. But one of the things that's important is also this idea that really comes through the study of Chicago, and increasingly, of course, other cities too, of the persistence of place. So this is kind of just one example from Rob Sampson's book, but it's a plot that's so simple that I think is important. And it speaks to both permanence and change, as things always do. But what you see here is essentially a plot of, on the y-axis, percentage of families in poverty in 2000, in this case, and percent of families in poverty in 1960. So 4 decades before. This means essentially that all the populations turn over. It's not the same people. Maybe it's the descendants of people who were there, but maybe not. And even though the line that you see there is not a one-to-one line, it's close. So you can see that the neighborhoods that are below the line have done better, have reduced poverty, and the neighborhoods that are above the line actually are doing worse. Okay, so in all this time, which has been a time of general progress, there are many neighborhoods, if you look at them, most of them are neighborhoods in the south and west sides, they're doing much worse. And so I just singled 2 there in blue. You see Washington Park is one of the neighborhoods that, that has much larger poverty. It's most distance from that line. And Lincoln Park, a neighborhood that, of course, has changed its character, gentrified to some extent, but also is quite different from it used to be. But this is just to show you that unless we were to look at, we can discuss all these things in abstract terms, but we have exquisite knowledge of a lot of what is happening on what time scales, what kind of populations, and even a whole history of Chicago in data. Okay, this is just a complement of what I showed you before. Maybe I should have shown you the slide a couple slides ago, but this is showing the measures of who is segregated by income, right? So on the x-axis, you have income groups, and on the y-axis, this is a measure of how concentrated by neighborhood certain income groups are. And so the higher you are, the more concentrated you are in specific neighborhoods. So you see, and this is actually typical of all cities, that actually the richest people are the most segregated, right? So it never happens that rich people typically move to a poor neighborhood and maybe have a bigger house or whatever. What you see is that they're all basically concentrated in certain parts of the city, certain neighborhoods. And in Chicago, as you can see here, because the bar is higher, it's even more so than in LA, which already is high, and even more so than in New York. You also see that the poorest neighborhoods are quite concentrated, which is the picture I showed you. But what's interesting here is that middle incomes, middle class, if you will, are actually the glue. These are the people that kind of could be found more or less anywhere in the city. They exist and they live in poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. And so the city is mixing in all these dimensions. And this is kind of stuff that we're just seeing now with new data. But that really is becoming sort of interesting from the point of view of the processes that both keeping the city together, place by place, but also blowing it apart. Okay, so a couple more measures. These are some new metrics that are coming in, sort of hot from the press, and they're part of activity of various people here at the University of Chicago, including ours. This is about life expectancy. There's a lot of discussion about life expectancy. I wanted to show you on top, this is data from the city, that life expectancy in Chicago has been going up. We are now in a period in the United States in the last 5 years where life expectancy is not going up and starting to go down. That's a different conversation. But what you see here is that even though life expectancy has gone up everywhere by and large, there's a strong pattern again of inequality for this quantity, which is not an economic quantity. In some sense, a decent society should address and close. And you see in particular a place like Washington Park versus Hyde Park, which is the classical comparison, which has one of the strongest differences across the city. And so part of the work we're doing is to generalize this according to a measure that's known as the Human Development Index. And this includes basically a geometric average of educational attainment, life expectancy, and real income. It's a quantity that goes beyond GDP and tries to measure both, people's knowledge, people's access to a healthy and long life, and people's, purchasing power in real terms. And this has been interesting because it's the gold standard for development at the national level. And you see there the table, some of the countries that are on top. The United States is number 17, and it's been following through the ranks, not because it doesn't well economically, though it doesn't do so well as some of the leading countries anymore, but because it does poorly, relatively speaking, to richer countries in terms of both health and education, mostly because of inequality. So what you see there is basically sort of the unfolding of this pattern all the way down to Chicago. And when you zoom into Chicago, which again is this idea that we can kind of go and see Chicago, you see a somewhat familiar map. These are census tracts, but you see parts in the city, including Hyde Park, where by this measure, life is better than the best country, which is Norway. And then you have parts of the city not far away, right, where it is worse than China or Mexico. So think about this, because I'm about to tell you, of course, where populations are coming and going, and sort of the character of the city and what holds it together. So, would you stay in Chicago if your life was worse than China or Mexico? And the answer might be no, right? So this kind of pattern of inequality is kind of this hardened fact that we kind of get hammered over, and that we get sometimes to think as inevitable in Chicago, which it is not. But nevertheless, and it's what I hope to demonstrate you in data is that this is a changing pattern, but it's a pattern that can be addressed as well. So to finish that story, this is census tract by census tract, how census tract behave in terms of the Human Development Index and in terms of these two measures, which are classical measures of neighborhood effects and opportunity, namely percentage of people in jail in each neighborhood and percentage of teen pregnancies. So what happens is that, like all these other neighborhood effect indicators, these indicators are very characteristic, are very quite predictive, even though there's, as you can see, there's also some variation of all kinds of socioeconomic outcomes. So when you find that a population is isolated and has certain social problems in these maps, they tend to be concentrate all kinds of issues. And this really is consonant with this idea of ecological effects and with how we understand human development as being a systemic problem of development that plays out locally and for populations that cannot access opportunity and in some sense are left in a segregated and an isolated state where it's difficult to access sort of all the advantages that cities in general can create. I'm sorry, that happened again. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit more about data. This is data that was created by Nico Marcio, who's our data scientist, data czar at the Mansueto Institute. It's data about how well Chicago is doing in terms of its economic sector. So it's data about exports for various cities. And this gives you sort of a snapshot of the valuable of sort of the export sectors in each city. And so what you see here are basically the most important export sectors. It's a couple of years old now for Chicago. So I don't know how easy or difficult this is to read, but the top is iron and steel. Then there's a bit of management and finance. A lot of the headquarters for these companies are here. But there's a certain amount of iron, steel, grain, and a bit of finance associated with that. It's not particularly a 21st century economy. This is just for comparison, Boston, right? Boston was an industrial city until recently, but it's a city that, a bit like Chicago, has exceptional educational institutions. But it's also a city like, if you think about Kendall Square, this transformation, that really in the last 20 years turned the corner and created sort of a logic of growth and a complete transformation of its economy. And you see this here. You see the R&D services, educational services, precision instruments. This is the economy that you see in a very rich country. And it's not the economy that Chicago has. And finally, I want to show you demographic maps. And this is sort of the most important thing I can tell you today, which is what is happening in terms of the amounts of people coming and going and what is likely to happen in Chicago in the next few years, but also to the region. So some of you might have seen the last census, the census data that's about to come out for census 2020. And it's showing that Illinois and then Chicago is actually losing population. And at a level of state, as you can see here, this is it's been rare in American history. And Illinois is in the dubious company of West Virginia, Mississippi, and of course, Puerto Rico, which has experienced now for a while very strong population decreases. And on the right, what you find is analysis by the Metropolitan Authority. And it's really about where this population is being lost in sort of the greater Chicago area, Chicagoland area. And so what you see there is that essentially these yellow spots are, are the places that are losing population. So you see again the south and west side, and then you see sort of the suburbs gaining some population. This is also a trend. So again, this is showing you again on the left, where is population being lost and gained, mostly lost. And you see that it's mostly in Cook County and sort of the more inner parts of the city, and that suburban counties are still growing somewhat. And this is something that we know, though we don't have yet numbers, has happened through the pandemic. So there's sort of a de-densification of cities, even though there's not necessarily an abandonment of cities. So we're still trying to figure out what that will look like, particularly in this year of recovery. But the point is that this is a new phenomenon of the last 5 years, that Chicago is now a shrinking city. And this is the most important thing I can tell you today. Chicago ambled along in some ways as being a city with many problems, but still with a very strong dynamics of its own possible transformations under a dynamic of growth, which has been decelerating. But as a shrinking city, as you can see in the South Side, but also you can see in Detroit or Pittsburgh, it's very difficult. Everything enters sort of a vicious cycle of decay in terms of government revenues, public services, attracting new population and so forth. All this can start unraveling. And so this is the main problem, that until Chicago becomes attractive to more people, that will become a major source of stress. And what you see on the right is also that Chicago is aging. So it's not only, even though inner Chicago is a little younger, okay? And in some sense, if Chicago is going to turn itself around, it needs to be attractive to both American-born populations, which are important, but they're mostly going to the Southwest and the South at the moment, including from the Midwest, but also to international populations. Chicago, I'm not going to show you a plot, but Chicago is less attractive, and whenever other things are accounted for, than New York or LA or Houston to international migration. And this is one of its disadvantages, one of the reasons why it's starting to shrink a little faster ahead of other cities. And so if Chicago is going to reverse that cycle, it will also change its character to become a much more Latino and Asian city, particularly South Asian city. Okay, I want to finish this section and then basically conclude the talk in a moment. But I want to recognize that Chicago in sort of the last few years has really been a pioneer in some efforts to use data to turn itself around and start to design policy in a different way. But at the same time, I think with the Lightfoot administration, the events of the more recent years, that strategy was questioned for good reasons. So Chicago was a leader in open data and still has an open data portal, and was able, for example, to actually use that and use sort of state infrastructure to actually obtain certain conditions of operation for share economy, rideshare, and so forth that were in some sense seen as pioneering among other cities. And has also been a leader in sensing with the Array of Things, which is based here at the university, led by Charlie Catlett, but also at the university at Argonne. And now with sort of a version that will replace in part the Array of Things called Project Eclipse, which is a collaboration with Microsoft. So there's a lot going on, and some of it is cutting edge, but it hasn't been brought together as a system. So what I want to now reflect upon is sort of this tragic situation where we conditioned ourselves in large part to think of ourselves as it is real, but the question is whether it's enabling or disabling, to see ourselves effectively as an unequal city that's stuck. And where could we go with this from the point of view using data? So what I'm going to do is not to tell you about sort of smart cities and techno utopias. There's a role for some of this, but it's not in addressing social planning and socioeconomic issues. And pick up this theme, which is the theme that started with the Emanuel administration of thinking about a sustainability plan for the city. But that after that, not much happened. And in some sense, with all the events of the last few years, this was left sort of in limbo, as far as I know. And in some sense, if you go even online, but of course, as you talk to the city, it's not very clear where we're going with this, even though there are elements that will continue. But if you look at other cities, inevitably, a place like LA, which pioneered the introduction of social equity as a main dimension, a main driving unifying dimension of sustainability plans, or New York or other cities internationally, a lot has happened. So I want to tell you a little bit about that and conclude. Okay, so one of the things that I think are very generative is that these kind of sustainability plans have not been thought of in the Chicago flavor, thinking of ourselves as communities and the inequalities and diversities that exist between them. So when the Lightfoot administration was coming to power in a collaboration with the Chicago Council for Global Affairs, we really wrote about the possibility of bringing these metrics, which are consensual across the entire world, I'll tell you more in a second, to really understand Chicago communities and sort of try to gain traction on what a community development plan for the city as a whole would be, but also with local indicators that are true to the needs of communities. So this is our sustainable development goals. And the point about this is that these are sort of international agreements. And the point is that cities are now implementing these, often in the absence of national traction, for example, in the US, but also in other countries. So the torch of basically these sustainability plans have come to cities. And I want to just pick up a little bit on what that means and how this must be led by communities. So back to Woodlawn, you can think there's a tradition of community organization. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with Saul Alinsky, but just a tradition of really working in the system, sometimes against the system, but with the system in order to create a plan. And one of my treasured possessions is another little thing that I found at the University of Chicago Library, which is sort of the precursor of the Mansueto Institute. That was a Center for Urban Studies in the 60s and 70s. And its main fruit was really a creation of, helped create the Woodlawn Model Cities Plan, which is a plan by the community of Woodlawn with scientists and students from the university as consultants and helpers to create essentially a community-driven, today you'd call it a sustainability plan. It's full of data, it's full of interesting points, but it's also a wonderful document. Again, you can see this, I think, at the library. But it is really truly a modern plan, a plan that all these now goals that are being expressed internationally are trying to capture. So here's another bit of it. I'm not going to stay with it, but it's actually a history of dysfunction with the city, and in some sense, in part, the tension with the university as an institution, but a history also of redemption of the people of the university and the people of the neighborhood coming together with a modern visionary idea of the plan. So I'm just going to show you what LA has been doing, and then I'll conclude. So LA and New York and where all this takes us. So what's happening is that all these ideas of sustainable development are essentially allowing us to have a common language, a common symbolic language, and in some sense, a set of numbers and indicators, data, to actually deal with a lot of problems that we're struggling with in Chicago, but also everywhere, of social justice, but also the decarbonization, of economic development, of inequality, including gender inequality and other things. So cities that are doing well are doing very well with all kinds of things. So that was LA. This is Barcelona. Barcelona, in my opinion, has the best approach and has these plots that show you where they want to go and how difficult it is. And in some cases, for example, here on the left about homelessness, they're not doing very well. This is the city of Espoo in Finland. I was just talking to them last night, so I thought I'd include the slide. You see again poverty, which is surprising, but almost every city has about 10 to 20% of people at risk of poverty. And Espoo is a little bit lower, but still, nevertheless, this is a concern for any city. And decarbonization, as you can see there in blue, the introduction of technology with heat pumps just starting to save the day, but how difficult it is actually to do this, and how it would be impossible without data to be able to track, but also to express sort of our ideals in ways that can actually be checked. And in some sense, this is an example of New York. I just want you to focus on what this does, on what kind of structure and mindset, what kind of cultural change these plans do. So on the one hand, they force the city to think about ways to measure that are aligned with people's needs and with environmental needs as well. And they integrate a lot of things that you can see here on the left. So New York City measures thousands of things. I'm not sure what Chicago measures, but things like housing, parks, neighborhoods, and so forth become part of a holistic objective. I learned this first from Mayor Garcetti of LA, that tells you basically that he didn't have any power, but by doing this, he becomes the champion for integrated visionary policies. And he himself, of course, becomes very famous, but the city gains a lot of visibility and a lot of credit. And so you see, every city is doing this sort of tracking of objectives. There's some there about New York City. New York City has been a lot more about climate change than social equity. Okay, this is my last slide. We're more or less on time, not too late. But I want to end not with a solution. The solution is not for me or anyone in particular to create. But what I want to suggest to you is that the way to think about data, the way to think about a data-driven city, if you will, is really to think about a system that allows us to see the city, but also imagine how it could be transformed, and to use data really as a glue, as a social glue, to express common objectives and to express how well we're doing, and sometimes to change those objectives as necessary. I hear a lot from Chicago when I give talks about this theme, that I hear this from academics. They don't want to be measuring things like sustainable development goals. I hear this from the city. How dare you say that Chicago should do what others are doing? And I hear this from communities that obviously want to have the prerogative about what to measure and set as goals. But the truth is that when you look at the breadth of these objectives, they actually have things for everybody, and they require everybody to work together in order to achieve them. So Chicago needs to become a better city than it is today. This is true of every city, but it's especially true of Chicago at this point. The most important thing in terms of just enabling other things is to reverse this demographic demise. If we enter demographic demise, it's going to be catastrophic. And we'll be able to tell that in the next 5 to 10 years. We need to be attractive to residents, both the people who are here and newcomers. What this transition of slowing down demographics forces us is to go from quantity to quality. We need to treat people well and enable them such that cities do well. So imagine that. We need to reinvent its economic base. You saw more or less what that is. This is no news. And reinvent, I think this is harder, it's social contract. It needs to express what it is. It needs to create sort of a better city in that sense. So we don't have a lack of knowledge or data. We have sort of frameworks that could serve the purpose. We even have approaches through neighborhoods and diversity that are very Chicago, that could in some sense become the Chicago flavor of these approaches. But in some sense, I think we need to create sort of a new symbolic culture, not one of separation, where data is telling us everything that's wrong with the cities and how we're segregated, but one in which we see how to bridge these gaps and imagine the future in a way that puts everyone sort of on the same map and on the same future. So with that, I'll stop and stop sharing and opening up for a little discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Luis. That was an absolutely fascinating trek from the beginning of writing and symbolic culture. I was fully prepared to attempt to drag you back to the importance of symbolic culture with a question about it, and then you ruined my good question by bringing that up in your final slide. So thank you for that. We do actually have a number of questions that have been submitted during the course of your presentation, and for those who are watching, I would encourage you to continue to submit as the conversation continues. But I think one that came up that does get exactly at this point of the importance of sort of our fundamental symbolic structures. One of our attendees asks, do we need to quantify equity in order to reach agreement of its importance as a guiding principle in designing cities and maybe evaluating our urbanization?
Yes. Yes, and there are many places and they are doing this, they're quantifying it. It's not a single quantity typically because there are dimensions of equity, economic, can imagine gender, but essentially, yes. So there are many measures of economic opportunity, of educational opportunity and attainment, of gender equality and participation from politics to economic life. And this is what all these cities are doing. They're measuring it, they're setting goals, making sure they achieve, measures of equity that can be revised, but they tend to be consensual, and they move in that direction. But it means that every year you see these plans force you to evaluate data at least every year, right? So if you're not doing well, you kind of got to know. And they require you to express, I think most importantly, in terms of speaking quite generally, I don't think the equity in Chicago is radically different from equity necessarily in other places, but we can express what we think it should be. And that's part of forming a common culture that would hold us together, right? That, people in the city respect, that people in nonprofits respect, that foundations respect, and that people in communities can be on board with. That's the work that I'd like to see more. We have a lot of good players, but I don't see a system of converging to stuff that moves us forward and takes us away from a logic of conflict and separation. So there are many ideas on that. We could go into more detail, but yes, it's being done and it's become essentially a glue and the vision of the future for many places, but also has to be contextually appropriate.
It occurs to me that we symbolize and construct symbolic structures around those things that matter to us. And one of our other questions kind of gets at that question sort of in a more fundamental way about our system. You made mention early on in quoting a scholar about the history of ancient Greece, that this idea of distributing the fruits of cooperation hasn't been especially well realized in modern day US cities. Is this an outcome of a specific economic system? Do you believe that capitalism, for example, even allows for this?
Well, that's a big question that we all should spend time on. I think that cities have to balance lots of things. So I think the capitalism versus socialism debate, when you think about how a city works in practice, is pretty sterile. Even though it's there are capitalistic markets, the socialistic institutions, if you will. There's also a practical reality. And I think that in American cities, we have had a somewhat ideological approach to particularly economic policy in cities that has been detrimental and has led to a lot of underinvestment into public goods and public infrastructures. But at the same time, I think those investments have to be looked at from the point of view of the previous question of equity, of what they create that's good, such that there's a sense that we value those investments, not just because they create more economic growth, but they create other forms of well-being, like better life expectancy, right? Things that are pretty tangible, or better education and well-being in some ways that are perfectly measurable. So I like to kind of break that dichotomy of sort of 20th century ways of thinking about the economy. I like, for those of you who like that, I mean, I think one of the starting points is sort of Karl Polanyi's thinking about the fact that capitalism in some sense needs to deal with the fact that it needs to treat people not just as labor, but as persons, right? It needs to treat nature as, not just a place to extract and dump, but as sort of a partner, if you will. And it needs to, I think, also deal with something that's newer, but knowledge and identity and so forth. There's also a dimension that is not necessarily internal to the economic system. I think the lesson from COVID is also that all these things are obvious, right? Like there's no economy without government. right? And there's no government without medicine, right? And there's no medicine without science, and et cetera, right? So you need to create sort of a complex system and all these things are self-reinforcing and not have a dichotomy that to grow the economy of a city, you need to continue to have a lot of inequality and poor environment. But cities are places where sort of this new logic has to come together and be demonstrated. And I think it's an interesting question, particularly if you're younger, to think about the formal economics or the formal social economics of these systems, which you don't quite have sort of as a theory that we can manifest and demonstrate easily. So it's a very important intellectual challenge. We all think it's true, I think, but to really demonstrate it in a way that goes beyond some of the oppositions that we understand more formally is important.
There's another question that gets at some of the particular slides that you flashed a little bit earlier. You showed a series of visualizations of segregation by income, indicating the sort of the bipolar distribution of the segregation among very poor income brackets and likewise among richer households in particular. You made mention of households in the middle income brackets as the glue, something that kind of integrates. So middle income families are living in a wider array of neighborhoods. Is that true across all racial groups, do you know?
That's a good question. We're just studying this a little bit better with slightly better data. I believe it is, but there's different signatures for different racial groups. There's a bit of an interplay between race and income in that. Bill Wilson's argument actually was that that glue had been lost in some of the traditional Black neighborhoods of Chicago in that time in 1980s. But I think it's an issue that needs to be revisited empirically. I don't want to tell you yes or no, because I think it needs to be qualified. But what we see when you go at looking at data like this is that these just as you see here, that that middle income people can be found in poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. In some sense, if you had to guess where does a middle income person live in Chicago, they could live more or less anywhere. That's less true of race, of course, but there's a question about how race and income and other measures interplay. For example, youth is another measure of mixing. Curiously enough, young people are much more mobile, and they also tend to mix more. Not always, but they tend to. So there are many dimensions of glue, even using the traditional dimensions in which we think of people. But also, it's important to think that even though these results are averaged across every neighborhood, there are neighborhoods where people mix more across these dimensions, and other neighborhoods where they mix less. So it's not like, again, don't believe the stereotype. The stereotypes contain some truth, but there's sort of an unpacking, and there are many particular situations that should give you both hope, I think mostly hope, but sometimes some despair.
We have a question that's a little bit more focused on method, and I think it might be a good moment to introduce that here. Fantastic presentation as usual. Thank you, Luis. With a continuous increase in computational power and in data availability, are there methodologies you could propose to aspiring urban scientists to make more sense of the complexity of cities?
Yes. So I think we're still struggling to kind of go away from this vision, still, Chicago school kind of vision of the city, even if it's expressing all this diversity and equality. So most of the sort of the complexity of cities, if we speak a little bit formally, it really speaks to dimensions of connectivity, right? How are people connected? So people explored, for example, showing that we're doing a lot of this with cell phones, both to show, again, integration and disintegration. James Sachs has done some work here, but Rob Sampson's group at Harvard has done a lot of work as well in a different way. Mark Berman's group here also has done some work. We see with cell phones where people go, who they're mixing with, for example. And of course, people are not stuck in their neighborhoods as we used to think. And so, for example, the center of cities tends to be a place of integration, and some public spaces are places of integration. Everyone goes there at some point. And this is good, right? It creates a certain place where maybe we all can see each other and get used to each other and so forth. Whereas the neighborhoods sometimes don't have that character. So there's a much more dynamical sense in which we can see how we're connected. And then, the other dimensions, this is connectivity, but social connectivity is not observable directly. It has to be seen sort of indirectly. And then the other aspect is to do essentially with information, which speaks to this issue of data, right? What are sort of things that people do together because they believe in the same things, or they're kind of rowing in the same direction?
That's a little tricky, right? But you see that in entrepreneurial data, you see people converging certain neighborhoods to live. You can see, that through public opinion, for example, asking whether people trust certain outcomes or don't trust certain outcomes. Those are all measures of how we connected, and in some sense of the collective spirit and the collective action that a city is capable of or not capable of. I think we're still bad at measuring those things, even though work here at U Chicago, originally with surveys and now increasingly with analysis, for example, social media and other things, is leading some of the way. But there's still a lot of work to be done with understanding those points better. But once you put those together, sort of information, connectivity, and so forth, we have sort of ways of understanding sort of not just how elements of the city compete with each other, but how they have common purpose and how they're connected. And I think that that's the key. So stick around, there are lots of work to do, and please reach out. There may be some things you can do already.
Well, and right along the way with that, Luis, it might be a great moment if you could say a word, given that our audience tends to be college students. What are some of the classes that you teach in the college that explore some of these methods and or topics in a little bit more depth?
Sure, I only teach, I teach a second class, but the one class I teach in the college is Introduction to Urban Sciences. And it's essentially, it uses Chicago throughout, as I mentioned, as an illustration, because it's also a canonical illustration for the field. But it's also, it's sort of I teach it in the fall, so coming up. And it's sort of, I call it a grand tour of urban concepts, but it takes you again through this mixture of conceptually rich and interdisciplinary view of the city and the many things, many angles that several disciplines have taken in understanding the city, but bringing them together and using a lot of existing and emerging evidence, including data in the style that I showed you today, that illustrates these issues. There's also points, as was asked, about possibilities for what we could do, either using data or going to get data or going to get some other form of knowledge or evidence that would allow us to understand cities. So I try to call it, forgive me, this is a bit presumptuous, but it is in some sense trying to bring sort of this interdisciplinary, what the National Science Foundation calls convergent research, which is interdisciplinary, but also practice to theory and back again. Sort of, and using cities as the inevitable sort of places where that becomes possible. So that's the one I recommend the most. Then I'm creating a new graduate course for a certificate that we have at the Mansueto Institute on focusing more on sustainability and particularly the issues. So it doesn't have a name yet, it's probably something like sustainable urban systems. And it's about sort of confronting what I call the four crises of the 21st century. So, climate change, equity, prosperity, and biodiversity, and why they're here now, partly to do with all these processes of development, particularly playing out globally and urbanization, but also how cities can imagine themselves, partly through this last part of the talk today, but also in ways that are deeper, that we can analyze deeper, in terms of resolving or solving or addressing some of these issues and becoming parts of the solution. We're still seeing who that, if that course will be available to college students, but it's a possibility. But there are many other people that we mentioned in our website, go and look, and many people associated with the Institute that also teach very interesting courses. So I encourage you to look at that.
We have two classes, there are two questions that are sort of coming from different directions on this question of sort of master planning. One simply asks, how would you go about designing a sustainability or a master plan for the city of Chicago? The other pushes back a little bit on your preference for LA's planning. Similar things are happening here in Chicago. We Will Chicago, although it doesn't directly address the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, the plan is trying to address equity and environment issues. But to go back to the earlier question, what would your steps be if you were consulting with the current administration or the next Chicago administration to sort of go about implementing a sustainability plan for the city?
Right. So I'm going to put aside all kinds of political considerations, which I'm obviously not the best expert on that, though I appreciate that part of it. I mean, I think that the administration came in, which is not an original idea, but it's an idea that I think continues to need to be implemented better, with sort of a localized approach to what a sustainable Chicago might mean. So, addressing on the one hand, so it's a multi-scale approach, community by community, probably based on community areas. There was talk about, having a neighborhood-based plan for Chicago. It's had different names. It's called the Marshall Plan and other things. But to basically have communities and the rich ecosystem that we have of nonprofit organizations and foundations come together and think about what are the objectives for different communities. Now, but not do that as much as that has to have a local impetus. Also, I think, if I were mine to do, I would ask, what's the alignment with all this thinking that other cities and other neighborhoods are doing? And if necessary, bring some people from a different city, from a different community, and ask about how do they do it, like a peer group, right? Doesn't have to be the scientist or the politician. But really try to create sort of common agreement about what the objectives are, how do we track them, and then hold the city to policies, the city, but also other players that move us in that direction, and then prepare people that this is a 10 or 20-year plan, right? And there have to be investments that are aligned with these objectives. The thing that's also important, and it's every city struggles with it, but I imagine we would struggle too, is that this cannot be a parochial plan. In the sense, it is true that each community has to have its objectives, but this gains strength as different communities also share some objectives and learn how to solve their issues, because they're part of sort of an ecology of neighborhoods and of a city and of an ecology of cities. They're addressing things that have similarities. So that is often difficult, but it's really essential. It's the way you gain traction, how you lock in that this doesn't go backwards. So you have to create a system around this. And this is what, other cities that now have been doing this for 10 years, have been tracking things, have been able to do across even several mayors. And, it's just that what Garcetti really explains is that I needed to entrain the bureaucracy to not do what they do every day, and to actually do what they do every day aligned with this bigger picture. And this allows me to sort of be the ambassador and the cheerleader, but also the guy who kind of drives all this inspirational stuff. And I think we're not there in Chicago yet. I know it's more difficult, but in some sense, we need to find the local, the flavor in Chicago of doing that with our own identity. And again, I think a community by community driven, where we celebrate our diversity, but also learn from each other, right? Neighborhoods of different characteristics, rich and poor, black and white, whatever. That spirit of collaboration and a shared future is part of sort of the symbolic culture I'm talking about, right? But that needs to be a practice, not just an idea, right? So it takes some time. But I think the administration came in with the right idea, and I want to celebrate all the work that's being done. So thank you for pointing that out. I don't mean to say that nothing's happened, quite the contrary. But I also, I'm most critical to those that I love the most. And so I'd like to see us, be doing better than New York and LA, even as we define what doing better means in our own sense. And this problem, really have strong communities and having sustainable development with all these objectives that communities believe in, is something that I hope I said quickly, but in a clear way. Chicago has a history of this. And the whole movement of sustainable development in cities needs an approach that is like that. So Chicago could be the leader for this. So I think our identity is something that sort of the world and other cities are looking for.
Speaking of the world and other cities, we do have another question specifically about the ways in which cities can track this globally. How can we ensure robust data collection across countries in order to standardize indicators like the HDI? Does that need to happen to adopt its use in a more meaningful way and perhaps even replace GDP as our basis for comparison?
So yes, data is never perfect, right? If you dealt with data ever, it's not perfect. And it's always a work in progress, and you need to know where the bodies are buried. So the problem of data collection is interesting, because it's both sort of interesting as new data sets come in, who's responsible for collecting and tracking that data. But also it can be, if it's used well, be a leveling element, particularly when it's used locally. So a lot of the people I worked with internationally, and also there are many examples in Chicago and the US, if a community is the expert on itself, right? It should be the ones who know best what their problems and what their challenges and what, if something got done or not done, right? And so that's an advantage. And if we could agree that a certain indicator, whatever it is important to drive the action of the city or the action of the federal government, then that community should definitely be the verifier whether that's being done or not. So that's a position of empowering a community and local actors towards doing that. But it's also a social contract that we're agreeing on something, and that the community has to express their need in a certain way that's understandable to people far away. So that's very important as actually a process. And I think it's something that has been sort of on the thought of many different people, and city governments are important in implementing that, but it's not, there's no magic bullet to do that well. And I've not seen that, we could discuss that more, but that's very important. On the other hand, the way it's happened is kind of disempowering, but still could be enabling, which is that national governments do it or city governments do it. And often they don't understand local dynamics, but they can be sort of a place where a certain statistical standards can be maintained. In the United States, that's often done through statistical agencies like the census, who are very good, but nevertheless still suffer from this bird's eye view. So all these technologies that we have now and all this potential participation that we have makes possible, including all these ideas, is that it's possible to do both. It's possible to have, large scale aggregation and national agencies, and it's possible to disaggregate them and have data be meaningful to people in place. But that requires sort of a structure of data collection that needs to evolve, and where probably local governments play an important role in mediating between things like the census, which do collect local data, and sort of often the subjective, but important, often quite objective living experience of communities, right? So, the kind of data collections that we're talking about for these things, they're big, but compared to the technologies we have, they're not that big. That's not the main problem. The problem is agreeing on a system where we all agree that we're doing the same thing and that thing is the right thing to do, but at least approximately right for now.
So I'm glad we came back to system, because my last question is really about a system that, if I'm hearing you correctly, I think you would argue that we are moving beyond. You took us on this wonderful visual journey through all these beautiful maps of Chicago, all of them coming out of the symbolic architecture of the Chicago School, right? Which has now, a century plus long history. And of course, you mentioned a moment ago, the community is the expert on itself. Well, here we have scholars at the University of Chicago talking about Chicago, making it the most studied city in the world. And in the process, framing a whole number of disciplines that we continue to use to talk about cities 100 years later. This may be a question that kicks off another round of conversations in a future year. But as you consider the legacy of the Chicago School, the various schools of thought arising out of it, what do you consider, what leaps to mind as sort of some of the best elements that we carry forward from their work and their way of framing our thinking about cities, and what, if anything, leaps to mind as something that maybe we should be moving beyond at this point?
I think a lot of the good things early on were forgotten, and we at least don't always hold very clearly in our minds going forward. If you read a lot of the early documents were about the condition of people in urban environments. There was a lot of preoccupation for integration, for opportunities, for the psychology of somebody living in these complex environments and all the choices that they do and the collective behaviors that emerge. I think many of us are coming back to that, but it's a much more, people-centered, we use this term now in planning, people-centered approach to cities. So I think they couldn't do that back then, but it's also a much more dynamical view that things are possible, and sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they open up. This cosmopolitan view of the city coming together as a dynamical process that's complicated. If you read Park, that's really what he's talking about. And a lot of the way Park's essay, in particular in the city, is, I like to put it this way when we celebrate the book, and that was in a relaunch for the University of Chicago Press. It's really a book of questions. If you read it, I think I counted at some point, don't hold me to this, but that has something like 133 questions. It says, look, this is interesting about cities, spends 2 pages doing it, and says, here are 5 questions that we need to go and study, right? And if you look at those questions, have we set some of them? Most of them we haven't settled, and most of them are still interesting. Not all, but so that was a proposal to study the city, right? And a century later, we haven't quite gotten to it. So I like that, obviously cities, like anything, are so complex and so dynamical that will continue to change, but they also have a certain logic that's preserved. I think the aspects that are most negative were the ones I showed you visually, or perhaps the subliminal message that they send, which that we are a city that is segregated, that's diverse but segregated, that has a lot of delinquency, that the view of the city is a view of problems that we can map, and that we become a collector of these problems. But we don't become necessarily an actor. We're sort of an observer at a distance of these problems. So we become victims of circumstance. So it's a very structural view of social problems and structural view of the city. It's sort of a set of things that are locked in, but also are hard to change. So we can start animating those maps as I tried to do and show you, look, it actually has changed. Not always for the better, but but it has changed. So I think this view that the city is not a structure, it is also a structure, but it's much more dynamical and open and subjective, but also has its logic, is sort of what we're coming to see, both with new technologies and sort of in the 21st century, where we're all living in cities and struggling with these issues, and where we need to create a different future. But we need to invent it here for what it will be, and that we still need to do.
That is an absolutely spectacular place to end not only this particular session, but also our series. Thank you so much, Luis, both for honestly helping to inspire the conversation that has been going on for now 2 quarters, but also for helping us to round it out so perfectly.
It's my great pleasure. So it's always good to be here. So goodbye.
So on behalf of the college at the University of Chicago, Chicago Studies, the Parousia Program for Public Discourse, the Mansueto Institute, the Office of the President, we'd like to thank everyone for participating in this evening's presentation and in the other 14 events that have made up this series and engaged almost 1,000 people in thinking about the future of our city. The recording of tonight's session will be made available on the Chicago Studies website later this week. Supplemental materials about Dr. Betancourt's thought and work, including an erotic love poem carved into a piece of clay tablet, will also be made available there. As a reminder, our future series ends this Friday at 12:30 p.m. with the last of our Chicago Studies Conversations live podcast recordings. That will feature venue manager, promoter, and performer Adam Zanellini from Elastic Arts in dialogue about the future of Chicago's music scene. As part of the build-up to that series, I should also mention, we hope you'll share your own favorite Chicago music. Check out our Instagram for additional details on that. And of course, we very much look forward to seeing you virtually at next Wednesday's Chicago Research Colloquium and in person and on your bikes at our final Chicago Outdoors event this year, our in-person Southeast Chicago History Bike Tour, led by Dean Boyer and Professor John Mark Hansen. That'll be the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. And if you were paying close attention when Dr. Betancourt was talking about the consequences of deindustrialization for the city, this is a great place, a great way to experience that history by biking through some of the neighborhoods that have been dramatically reshaped by it. You can visit our Chicago Studies website to register for all of these events. And next year, we hope that you visit us, Program on the Global Environment, and the Mansueto Institute, all on the first floor of 1155 East 60th Street, as we co-locate, as Dr. Betancourt says. We so look forward to learning more about our city with you in the final weeks of this year and in the years to come. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great night.